Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Late Night Catechism, continuing as we are with our theme, our current series on the virtues. And this week we're going to look at temperance. Now, we've already covered prudence, and last week last week we looked at justice. And just before we begin on temperance, it's worth remembering that the whole point of the virtues is that they enable us, to live virtuously means to live to the full as a human person. That's essentially what the philosophy and the theology behind the virtues is all about. In other words, it's about being the best that we can be. So, with that in mind, let's look at temperance. Now, generally, when we talk about temperance these days, when people think of temperance, they think of moderation or voluntary self-restraint, which is a pretty apt way of describing it. Another way would be self-control. And perhaps that's the more relevant way in which we understand temperance as a virtue, and the practice of temperance or the realization of temperance as a virtue. It is about self-control. So typically we describe it in terms of what we as an individual might voluntarily refrain from doing, like restraint from revenge, by practicing non-violence and forgiveness, restraint from arrogance by practicing humility and modesty, restraint from excesses such as extravagant luxury or splurging by employing prudence, and restraint from rage or craving by practicing calmness and self-control. Temperance is the first virtue that perfects our ability to act well with oneself and from within oneself. So just as pride is the mother of all evil, and just as prudence is the mother of all virtue, so we might say temperance is the most practical realization, I suppose, of the virtues. And in terms of enabling us to be the best person that we can be, temperance is about behaving properly and respectfully oneself, and also about and from and within oneself. For it brings to order the concupiscible appetite, meaning that which is persuaded toward the negative, toward the destructive, toward the sinful. And thus it brings to order the emotions, love, hate, sensible satisfaction, satisfaction of the senses, desire, aversion, and sorrow, as they affect the good, the pleasant good, the ultimate good, the virtuous good that we are trying to attain. So temperance is primarily about desires for the greatest pleasures, and the greatest pleasures result from the most natural operations, which are those that have as their purpose the preservation of the individual and the preservation of the species. So this is with regard to what we might call our natural appetites. And that is why the greatest pleasures are to be found in the senses, really, in the consumption of, say, food and drink, and in the union of the sexes. So temperance is properly about pleasures of meat and drink and sexual pleasures. These pleasures, moreover, result from the sense of touch. So temperance is principally about dealing with and approaching the pleasures of touch, and thus secondarily about the pleasures of taste, smell, sight and sound, insofar as the objects of these latter senses, i.e. the smell of food, the sight of a beautiful body, are conducive to the pleasurable use of things that are related to the sense of touch. So the measure of temperance is the order of reason. The determination of the mean of reason depends upon the real needs of the present time. It depends upon intelligible human goods, like life, truth, beauty, leisure, sociability, religion. Intelligible human goods. In other words, things that we obviously understand as being for the good. The good has the aspect of an end. Human goods are intelligible ends. A good life on the whole is one that is ordered to its proper end, which ultimately, of course, is the possession of God. So the good of virtue consists in that order, for the proper end of a thing is the rule and measure of whatever is directed to the end, and everything within the human person is to be directed to the supreme end, which is the possession in knowledge and love of the supreme good, which of course is God. So, in other words, what we're saying is that all the virtues, to live virtuously, is ultimately to realize the good. You may remember last week when we talked about the virtue of justice, that is about the proper end of justice is goodness. And so it is with all the virtues, and likewise with temperance. The application and the use of temperance is to enable and to facilitate us to become the best that humanity can be. Ultimately, of course, our end is what? To strive to the likeness of God. We are made in his image. We strive to attain to his likeness. This is what our Eastern Orthodox brethren would refer to as theosis. Theosis, meaning, as Jesus puts it, to become like God. Not to become a god, nor to become gods, but as it were, to reflect and to mirror divine attributes of the good, of the supreme good. So there are, of course, there are intelligible human goods. Intelligible means that we can reason them, that motivate the human person, who is himself ordered to this supreme end of achieving ultimate good. And the pleasurable activities of eating and drinking are evidently ordered to the intelligible end of human life, that is, its preservation. In other words, we eat and drink to survive. The rule and measure of sexual desire will also be discovered in the intelligible ends of the sexual powers. In other words, the purpose of eating and drinking is survival, is to live. The purpose of sexual intercourse is procreation. So in the case of the application of temperance, the real needs of this life constitute the rule of reason that makes temperance a virtue. I'll repeat that again. The real needs of this life constitute the rule of reason that makes temperance a virtue. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "Wherefore temperance takes the need of this life as the rule of the pleasurable objects of which it makes use, and uses them only for as much as the need of this life requires." So in other words, the real needs of this life constitute the rule of reason, is basically saying that when the temperance enables us to use things as they are meant to be used, no more and no less. No more and no less. So how do we find the mean of this virtue? For example, one cannot say that 8 ounces of cornflakes constitute the mean of temperance when it comes to eating a bowl of cereal for breakfast. The mean depends upon the needs of the individual person and their circumstances. A large breakfast may very well be reasonable for the postman who is required to walk 20 miles a day delivering mail, but it may be excessive for someone who is only required to sit in a car and drive. So the mean here, we're talking about the balance of the application of temperance. So, in other words, how much moderation, how much restraint, what is excessive, what is not. The point we're making here is that unlike justice, for example, where something is right or wrong, something is fair or unfair, with the application of temperance is not quite so black and white, because it would always depend on the need of what's being employed at any given moment. So, for example, with the exercise of temperance re food intake, what we're saying there about breakfast is, so we want not to fall into gluttony. Gluttony, of course, is to eat to excess. So in the application of temperance, for example, a meal like breakfast, it's reasonable. We use reason to apply temperance. It's reasonable to deduce that a postman may require more for breakfast than somebody who has an office job, because the need refuel, which is what breakfast is, the need for fuel is going to be greater for that person who expends more energy than it is necessarily for someone who works in an office. So you see here that temperance, the application or the reasoning of temperance, is not all about self-denial, as we so often connotate it with and think of it then negatively. Actually, temperance is, of course, an exercise in prudence. Prudence is the mother of all virtues. So prudence necessarily is related to the exercise or to the application of temperance. However, the application of temperance again is again not always quite so obvious, because it's not necessarily always about weights and measures. So another way of thinking about temperance is about necessity, because as we know, things like gluttony is not just about food. It's not just about excessive eating. Gluttony in many ways is the mother of various other vices, including sexual perversions, excessive lust, or excessive desire, or excessive sexual desire, we may call gluttony. So the application of temperance there, of course, is not going to be about weights and measures, but about necessity, about understanding the necessity of something will determine how much restraint or how much moderation or prudence we need to apply. So temperance makes moderate use of those things that are not a hindrance to health and a sound condition of body, according to the demands of the situation in which one finds oneself. So temperance is not contrary to desire or pleasure. So those things are not strictly necessary for health, for example, as long as they have a necessity about them, then a little, we might say, indulgence now and again won't hurt. For example, it's not necessarily immoderate to snack on popcorn or potato chips while watching a movie with friends, or to enjoy some appetizers at a Christmas party. So temperance is not about necessarily denial. It is about moderation. It is about self-control. Now, insensibility is a vice that is opposed to temperance. Pleasure itself is not evil, but it is part and parcel of the natural operations that are necessary for our survival. Hence, it is fitting and reasonable that we make use of pleasures to the degree that they are necessary for our well-being, either our own or that of others. To reject pleasure to the extent of omitting things that are necessary for our preservation is unreasonable and immoderate. I'll just make that point again. To reject pleasure to the extent of omitting things that are necessary for our preservation is unreasonable and immoderate. Moreover, the use of reason depends upon the health of our mind and body, and the body, of course, is sustained by means of food and drink. So it therefore follows that the good of human reason cannot be maintained were we to abstain from all pleasures. That should come as a positive. Because always, you see, we think when discussing the virtues and when we talk about virtuousness, we always consider it in terms of denial and a negativity. But in fact, really what the virtues are about is simply being, simply living, we might say sensibly. So when it comes to the application of, say, temperance, see, it's not about, not necessarily about denial, it's just about control, just about self-control. And it's about recognizing that some things are necessary, and they're necessary to a certain measure, but they become unnecessary and then to our detriment when we do not exercise some control. So, taking food, for example, what we're saying is that eating is necessary. It's necessary to live. It's necessary to survive. It's necessary for our bodies to function properly. Therefore, it's necessary for our health and for our well-being. What isn't necessary is excessive intake of food. And again, the measure of temperance is not about denying pleasure. For example, we're not saying it's a bad thing if it's pleasurable. So, for example, a nice cup of tea, drinking a cup of tea, can be naturally pleasurable. Eating your favorite food is naturally pleasurable. Temperance says that's fine, but enjoy it in moderation. Enjoy it as much as you need it, and in as much as you need it, you can take pleasure from it. But it's when you go to excess, or when you start craving the pleasure over the necessity, that's when you fall into vice. Now, it's not a phrase that we tend to hear these days very much, but intemperance. Intemperance, which of course is the opposite then of temperance, intemperance brings about an arrest of emotional development, a personality arrest, so to speak. St. Thomas Aquinas refers to intemperance as a childish vice. Unchecked concupiscence is like a child in various ways. Anyone who has raised children knows that a child left to themselves does not attend to the order of reason. For example, if they had carte blanche over what they could have for lunch, or if they had carte blanche over what they could play or what they could play with. Taking a child to to a department store can be very taxing, because there's virtually no end to what a child thinks they need. Go shopping with a toddler, and it's constantly, mummy, can we have this? Mummy, I need this, all the time. Children in that sense are intemperate, in the sense that they don't perceive necessity, or they're not constrained by perceiving or thoughts of necessity. So not only are they not using reason, but in so doing, of course, they then also can become self-centered and selfish. So the concupiscible power, that persuasion to sin, if left to itself without the governance of reason, gains strength and becomes less and less able to subject itself to the direction of reason, like a spoiled child. So when we say that someone is intemperate, we're saying that they don't employ reason. They're not thinking rationally. They don't think things through rationally. So with regard to anything, like a child in a shop, the child isn't applying reason. It's seeing something that it likes, seeing something that it recognizes the need within itself to possess it. So the child is recognizing its own desires, its own wants, its own sense of need. It's not rationalizing about it. It's just, as it were, reacting from a gut instinct. Now, if that is indulged, or if that is left unchecked, then of course it becomes self-centeredness, becomes selfish. You often see this with when toddlers start school, and how children without siblings, when they start school, find it very difficult to integrate and to mix and to socially play with the other children. Whereas children with siblings, of course, they're used to sharing toys. They're used to engaging with the other in play. But a child who doesn't have that, as it were, external stimulus, is not exposed to having to think exteriorly or having to think about another, then of course becomes insular looking, inward looking, self-centered. So what we're saying here is that concupiscence, our persuasion to sin, if left unchecked, manifests itself by irrationality. Reason kind of goes out the window when we just give in to ourselves. So In the same way, then, that we correct children by exercising restraint, or sometimes imposing restraint, likewise, too, the same we can apply to concupiscence. So the natural persuasion that we have to self and to selfishness, we can moderate it according to the demands of virtue. So in other words, someone who is enslaved, as it were, to their concupiscence, meaning to their natural selfishness, is doomed. So just as we would generally say that there is a certain beauty in a good child of innocence and docility, but nothing beautiful about a spoiled child or a misbehaving child or a rude child. Similarly, we can say that the exercise of temperance, so that exercising that self-control, can bring about a spiritual or moral beauty to the person who cultivates it and exercises temperance, as opposed to intemperance, which destroys the clarity and beauty that belongs to temperance. Beauty, we might say, is the result of harmony. Beautiful prose, for example, is harmonious and clear. It is the lack of clarity that diminishes the beauty of a piece of prose. So intemperance, in the same way, is a disorder or a lack of harmony between reason and the concupiscible appetite. Intemperance is a disorder or lack of harmony between reason and the concupiscible appetite, the natural persuasion to selfishness and sin. And this lack, then, of harmony gives rise to disgracefulness. Intemperance is the most repugnant to human excellence, since genuine human excellence is essentially related to those abilities that are most characteristic of the human person, namely intelligence and will. But intemperance is about pleasures that are common to man and brute animal. The intemperate person, as they move away from reason, approaches the bestial level. And as they move away from reason towards the sentient level, the light of reason is increasingly dimmed. But it is from the light of reason, otherwise, the clarity and beauty of virtue arises. So in other words, we're saying here that if one doesn't exercise temperance of any kind and just continually gives in to oneself, and is only giving in then really to one's sensible, sense-orientated appetites and satisfaction, then, and is never using their intellect, never using their will, never using any kind of reason to think about or control their behavior, then they are really no better than an animal. They're no better than a dog, for example. Domestic dogs, particularly notoriously, cannot stop themselves when they've had enough food. Anyone who's ever had a dog knows dogs are perpetually hungry. They're not actually, but they think that they are. So dogs will always eat and they will eat and eat, and left to their own devices, a dog would eat itself to death, literally, because it reason to its intake of food. It's reacting instinctively, naturally, to food as fuel and pleasure. But it cannot check itself. And that's what happens to people. When people are intemperate, they become bestial. In other words, it's all reduced down to instinctiveness and to the satisfaction of appetite. And all reason and will and rationality goes out the window. And it's those things, of course, that make us human, that make us distinctly human as opposed to animalistic. And so when temperance is used, is exercised, temperance actually can bring about a spiritual beauty that in many ways can overflow into the body. For argument's sake, a woman might be, from a strictly physical point of view, stunningly beautiful and a perfect candidate for a successful modeling career. But often it happens that after a few moments of conversation with many such persons, their beauty thins out and begins to ring hollow. So St. Thomas Aquinas says, a thing may be becoming according to the senses, but not according to reason. So, we might see someone who looks attractive, but as we get to know them, we find out they're not as intelligent as we thought they were, or they're not as, whatever. Then our appreciation of them diminishes. Conversely, however, those who we can see who live a virtuous life, even though to the senses they might not necessarily be an oil painting, nonetheless there is yet something about them that we regard and relate to and respond to as beautiful. So somebody could be stunningly, physically gorgeous, to our senses. They look incredible. They look amazing. And then we get to talking with them, and within 5 minutes we realize, oh God, no. Yeah, beautiful to look at, but personality non-existent, or awful or atrocious. Other times we can meet somebody who is not attractive at all to look at, not attractive at all physically, but within 5 minutes of conversation with them, we've warmed to them, we're attracted to their personality, etc. And in the spiritual life particularly, we see this. I don't know how many monks or nuns over the years I've met who, from appearance, you wouldn't think anything of them at all. But within just moments of being in their company or their presence or their conversation, you see how they possess a real beauty. They possess a real attractiveness. Now, one of the subjective parts, we might say, of temperance is abstinence, which of course is about cutting back of food. So this is about the application of temperance. it makes no difference whatever to virtue, pardon me, it makes no difference whatever to virtue what or how much food a person takes, so long as they do it with due regard for the people among them, among whom they live, for their own regard in terms of health, but it does matter how uncomplainingly somebody does without food when bound by duty or necessity to abstain. So what we're saying there is that generally in the way of virtue, in the application of temperance, it doesn't matter how much or how little any given person at any time eats, as long as they as long as their approach to food is not selfish, and as long as it's beneficial to them, what they do take. But it does matter but it matters how but when somebody is constrained, being restrained by imposition, by rule of fast, for example, then it is only a virtue if, in the acceptance of that restraint, they do so uncomplainingly. Then we can say that they are truly virtuous. An inordinate appetite for food is generally more common than we tend to think of. It won't be long now either, think of a Christmas party, a buffet lunch or supper. We'll come across people who, in the process of stacking their plates, will clearly have little regard for those in the line behind them. And it seems to matter very little to them whether or not there will be enough for others if they continue to take what they judge to be according to their need. A judgment that will be clouded by inordinate appetite. Their ability, in other words, to consider others has been drastically compromised. Their reason has been drastically compromised. And where there should be a spirit of celebration and friendship in the air, one seems to detect a spirit of loneliness and alienation. Note, for example, all-you-can-eat buffets. People in these situations tend to feel that they need to get their money's worth. And so they believe it their right to eat until they can no longer so much as gaze at another plate without feeling ill. Now, so here we're saying, we're seeing here again a lack of the exercise of temperance, and that's the lack of the exercise of reason. And the person who behaves in that way at a social event has almost, as it were, lost sensibility, lost awareness of others. Remember that virtues are all about being the best we can be as a human person. And that necessarily implies having a concern, therefore, for the common good, as well as striving for the ultimate supreme good. So when we behave in that way in a social context like that, it is intemperate, and it is betraying a disorder within ourselves. Now, the habit of abstaining from food is important. Some professions require a great deal of patience, kindness, and gentleness, such as teaching or nursing. A necessary precondition for consistent patience and a genuine and consistent spirit of kindness and gentleness is a habitual detachment from the pleasures of touch. Love involves a real transcending of the self, for it involves loving the other not for my sake, but loving the other as another self, and thus as an end in themselves. And this cannot be consistently done, nor done well, unless one has cultivated this habit of reasonable detachment from the pleasures of touch, one mode of which is the pleasure of food. And this is why the practice of fasting, not only a religious requirement, but also, we might say, has a basis in natural law. Now, the principal purpose of fasting is to bridle the lust of the flesh, to constrain the lust of the flesh. St. Thomas Aquinas refers to fasting as the guardian of chastity. Now, contemporary popular culture has taken lust as the mean of virtue, the only criterion for sexual vice being the violation of a person's will, i.e. rape. There are a number of reasons for this, but the principal reason has to do with what is commonly regarded as the ultimate end of human life, or that which gives life meaning. If the purpose of human existence is simply the complete and ongoing satisfaction of the self's personal passions, without reference to intelligible goods such as life, marriage, justice, or religion, then self-love is the only kind of love that is possible for the human person. I'll just say that again. If the purpose of human existence is simply the complete and ongoing satisfaction of the self's personal passions, without reference to intelligible goods, goods that we can all recognize as being good, such as life, marriage, justice, religion, then self-love is the only kind of love that is possible for the human person. So the failure, for example, of marriages today is testimony to our inability to achieve as a culture a disinterested love. Now that's what I was referring to when I was talking about teaching or nursing professions. to be consistently patient, genuine, to be consistent in kindness and gentleness, requires a habitual detachment from the pleasures of touch. Meaning, really, to be able to exercise gentleness, kindness, etc., without the need nor provocation of sensory or sensible reward or fulfillment. So in other words, to be able to consistently treat all the children in a class, or to be able to consistently treat all the patients on a ward, teaching and nursing professionals, essentially, they may be unaware of it, even perhaps subconsciously unaware of it, but they actually practice a form of professionalism, which is a detachment, which enables them then to be fair across the board. So what we're saying here is that it is the better human being who can love without the need for touch sensory satisfaction. Now, the battle against self-love, of course, is difficult because it's a battle of personal freedom, the freedom to live for love, a disinterested and holy love. In other words, what I'm saying here is the dichotomy that we all face, that we all have to battle with, is that sense of self and love for self against that true love or expression of charity that we see, of course, manifested and believe is God. Again, I suppose what we're saying is that the people in nursing and teaching are able to manifest love in a detached way from any reciprocity, a little like, we might say, with God. Remember the whole point again of honing the virtues, practicing the virtues, is to become like God in the sense of good, not in the sense of ego. Now, this is an issue, particularly in our culture today. For example, the concept and notion that people have of marriage. And this is because every aspect of contemporary culture revolves around essentially the celebration of food and sexual pleasure as ends in themselves. Freedom from the negative influence of this culture as a condition of freedom for genuine love begins then, we might say, at the locus of the concupiscible passion for food. Remember, we're still talking about fasting. See, the way to battle, to go against this zeitgeist, is to do the opposite. So whereas the world is forever encouraging us to self-indulgence, then the opposite, of course, is necessary and true for self-improvement. But it's ultimately so that we may be able to love as God loves. And this is really what we mean by the phrase, I suppose, detached love. To be able to love without the necessity of it being reciprocal is to love, is what we mean by detached love. And that's necessary within, for example, marriage, because contrary to what so many people think about marriage, it's just think, two people come together and they're all into each other. The other becomes the sole focus for the other, and what generally encourages the relationship is mutual and self and reciprocated satisfaction and pleasure. So, so they delight in each other's company, but they delight in each other's appetites, etc. This is the way that most people in the world, this is the worldly view of what marriage is about. But from the godly perspective, no, it's marriage is about more than just the sensory pleasures. It's more than just about the mutual and reciprocal satisfaction or pleasurable satisfaction. And this is why so many marriages today fall apart, because it's all about, and it's all about satisfaction and pleasure. When the other doesn't start receiving that or getting that anymore, then it all falls apart. Whereas those who have been married for a long time know that the kind of mutual and reciprocal pleasure and satisfaction can wane. But what's left matters, because what's left is really what holds the marriage together and what marriage is really about, which is a love that is detached from just the passionate and the sensory and the satisfaction and the pleasure. It's a love that is, as it were, on a higher plane. So what we're saying here, part of the reason why fasts and fasting are suggested and recommended disciplines by the church. Excuse me. It's a long day. is to enable us to become detached or detachable from the purely sensory perception and appreciation of life and the world and the pleasures therein, in order that we can, as it were, appreciate and begin to manifest this detached love, this love that is not dependent on reciprocity of any kind. So another reason why we fast is so that the mind may rise more freely to the contemplation of truth. As a culture, we tend these days to be very indifferent to truth. In fact, the denial of truth in any objective sense of the word has become quite popular, in particular in the area of morality. And no doubt this lack of interest in truth has its roots in popular culture's almost exclusive preoccupation with sensible goods as opposed to intelligible goods, meaning intelligible goods meaning reason, sensible goods meaning touch, senses. For as one approaches the sensible, one at the same time moves away from the intelligible. So, you know, our popular culture is as we're saying, is completely preoccupied with satisfying and fulfilling the senses. And as that becomes more and more a thing, a phenomena, then of course it moves away from honing the intelligible and the exercise of will. Excessive sensuality compromises one's interest in the realm of the intelligible. The sensual mind is darkened on account of its almost exclusive immersion into the realm of matter, and it thereby shares in matter's opacity. Excessive sensuality compromises one's interest in the realm of the intelligible. So in other words, and this is really pretty much self-evident, using the discipline of fasting to hone the virtue of temperance counters the desire, the natural, as it were, concupiscence on our part, the natural persuasion to self-pleasure and self-satisfaction, and obsession and with possession of material things. See, one thing we, you know, anecdotally, you know, we will say of someone who is obsessed with material things is that they are devoid of spirituality. Or even we might say sometimes, and go further to say they are devoid of love, or they are incapable of love, by which we mean charity, sacrificial love, true love. Of course, they may be capable of reciprocal love, because of course that would probably, it's all about, again, satisfaction of their senses. And that's how they, and this is, you see, this is the problem with the world today, with our culture today, is it is extremely materialistic. people are always rating themselves and comparing themselves, contrasting themselves, all their hopes, their ambitions and everything else, all about stuff. It's all about stuff. The latest fashions, the latest technology, the latest this, that, and everything else. Together with, this constant need to satisfy themselves. The world is obsessed today with self-satisfaction. Me, myself, and I. And the trouble is that the more people get drawn in and sucked into that, the less able they are to begin to reason things out. Their faculty to exercise, as it were, reason and rationality is diminished and continues to diminish. So we're saying that here, for example, that the church's discipline of fasting, it's not just about denial, but it is about discipline. It is about encouraging us through fasting to detach ourselves from a dependence or from interpreting the world only through our sensory perceptions and satisfactions, in order to allow, as it were, our brains, in order to allow our capacity to reason and to rationalize, to grow. So gluttony then, of course, is the vice against temperance, because principally this vice regards not the quantity, but the desire for food and drink, a desire that is outside the order of reason. And this is an important point, because although a person may seem to exceed in quantity of food, this may not necessarily pertain to gluttony, for it may not involve inordinate desire. So too, a person might rarely ever exceed in quantity of food, yet sin continually in this regard. Remember what we were saying before, the exercise of temperance over gluttony. It's not about necessarily quantity, not necessarily about how much. It's about the necessity, or the perceived necessity or need. So gluttony, I mean, we always tend to think of gluttony re food, but gluttony is about, essentially is about excessiveness. It's about desire and a desire to satisfy. And in this sense, it is out of reason. It is out of order. So when we say someone is a glutton, we may mean they eat to excess, or they, but you can have a glutton of other things, a glutton of attitude towards materialism. And gluttony can destroy the entire moral and emotional life of a person on account of the vices to which it gives rise. So the glutton does not eat in order that he may live. Rather, he has reorganized his life in such a way that he now lives primarily to eat. Food and drink are no longer a means to an end, but have become the end towards which almost everything else in his life is ordered. So in what way does gluttony bring virtue to naught? Inordinate desire for food and drink gives rise to a host of offspring. Firstly, on the part of the intellect. We've already seen that attachment to the pleasures of touch compromises one's interest in the realm of the intelligible. But gluttony is already an immersion into matter that is unreasonable, and so the mind is dulled, for it has been drafted into the service of inordinate appetite. Its only focus now is on satisfaction. This affects, of course, then prudence. Prudence has the intellect as its subject, and prudence is, of course, the mother of all virtues. Without prudence, there is no virtue of any kind. There's an awful lot more that we could say about gluttony, so perhaps we'll carry that over into the next episode. I hope, and please, you must let me know. You must let me know that you understand what I'm talking about, because if I'm not communicating properly, then I need to do something about that. So please do, folks, let me know if what I'm saying makes sense, if it is intelligible to you, because otherwise there's not much point in it. Otherwise it's just loquaciousness for its own end, which, of course, well, we'll come on to that next week, because that is itself a sign or indicator of gluttony, but we'll come on to that next week. Please do, if you ask for clarity, ask for clarification, say if what I've said didn't make sense, tell me, and I will try to make it sensible for you. But temperance is, together with prudence, it's a very important virtue to know and to apply, because it can make all the difference in the way one lives one's life, and particularly, of course, it can make all the difference in terms of one's pursuit of righteousness and holiness, which is the purpose, of course, of our lives, ultimately, to achieve union with God, to strive after his likeness, to polish up his image, as it were, within us, so that we mirror and reflect his glory, his supreme good. So that was Temperance Part 1, I suppose, and we'll continue with that next week. Meanwhile, bless you for watching, and the next conference, of course, will be on Friday with Contra Mundum. Next broadcast will be Mass tomorrow morning. and of course the Angelus and Rosary tomorrow evening. So bless you for watching. As I say, please, feedback is welcome. It's good for me to know that, you know, that this is worthwhile, that this is worth your while, and indeed my own. So please don't be shy. Do give me feedback. Let me know if this is helpful, or if you want clarity or clarification. As I say, please just ask. Meanwhile, this was the Virtues, and that was Late Night Catechism. Take care, and God bless.